Hello everyone. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name is Courtney Chandrea. I'm a writer and a consulting astrologer, and today we're going to begin a new series looking at the astrology of some of our favorite books, and maybe some of our not so favorite books as well. Today we're going to be starting with exploring John Steinbeck's East of Eden. When I first started studying astrology, I knew I had to find a way to practice regularly if I was going to get any good at reading charts. A lot of people, when they're starting out, might look to celebrity charts as a way of beginning to see how somebody's life correlates with the symbols at play in their birth chart. But I've never really been a person big on pop culture, so this strategy didn't work very well for me. I just had a hard time staying motivated and finding different people and reading about their lives. It just wasn't correlating to what I'm naturally inclined towards. And then one day I was reading a short story collection called Mars by Asha Bakish. I think that's how you pronounce her name. As I was reading these stories, I was so struck by just how Mars in Cancer these stories felt. They dealt with things like violence in the lives of women and children, feminine rage, frustration and desire, and I was reading the story during a Mars in Cancer period, so these themes really jumped out at me. And so, being an astrologer, I went to look at the charts. When I couldn't find a birth chart for the author, I realized that perhaps I could find a publication date on the stories, and that at least would give me a birth chart of sorts to begin unpacking these stories. And after a lot of searching, I had to do some clever digging because it was a translated collection of stories. But looking at the first publication date for this collection of stories, I found that it was indeed published under a Mars in Cancer period. And this experience taught me that I could actually be looking at all of my books this way. So while I'm not big on pop culture, I read a ton. And I learned that unpacking stories this way, unpacking the books that I was reading in this way, was not only a really great way for me to develop my skills in recognizing the symbols and reading different charts, but it also deepened my understanding and appreciation for the narrative arcs that take place in the stories that I was reading. And isn't this what astrology does for us in our lived experiences as well? So before we dig in, let's take a look at the book itself. Just like in a birth chart reading, we want to start with some context. Context is super important because it gives us something for us to ground the symbols in. It's a lot like electricity. It seeks ground in order to speak. I'll be summarizing the big themes of this book, and the challenge that I've posed to myself is to see if I can do this without giving away any spoilers. And then once we have the basic context to work with, I'll pull up the birth chart and we'll see what we see. The reason I chose East of Eden to start with is, for one thing, I've just always wanted to read it. I've known that the topics that John Steinbeck deals with in his work have been close to heart. I've always been afraid that he might approach it with a cynical hand. I did not find that with this book. The other reason I wanted to pick it up is that I had been seeing word around the Substack street that Netflix actually filmed an adaptation of East of Eden recently, and it's slated to be released by the end of 2026. When I learned that this adaptation was going to be released this year, a little flag went up in my brain. I always find it really interesting when an older piece of work is being revived, and I think it often comes at a time when the themes or topics explored in that work are especially relevant in our lives right now. And so I was curious too if perhaps there's something happening in our sky right now that is in conversation with the birth chart of this book, East of Eden. So we'll table that for now, but once I pull up the chart, we'll look for that piece as well. East of Eden is first and foremost a family saga story that explores the intertwined lives of the Hamiltons and the Trask family, who find each other in the Salinas Valley in California. In addition to these two families, we have Kathy Bates, who is best described as a psychopath, and then we have Lee, a Chinese cook, who might be most aptly described as a philosopher. Though I have a feeling that Lee would argue with that, and he would probably have some really solid philosophical arguments to back himself up. This duality between Kathy and Lee's characters as the psychopath and the philosopher are super important because we see these archetypes come up again and again in this novel in varying spectrums, each one posing an extreme version of itself. The central point of the novel takes place around the moment of naming the twin sons of Adam Trask. Ultimately, these boys are named Aaron and Cal. A little bit of backstory here though. Shortly after the birth of the twins, Adam's wife left the family, leaving the twins entirely in his care, and in her loss, Adam was depressed, desolate, and he left the care of his sons to Lee. By the point at which we have this naming ceremony, these twin boys have been unnamed for a year. And when Sam Hamilton, the local Irish Renaissance man, he's definitely in the philosopher archetype, when he catches wind of this, he decides to take the matter in his own hands and push Adam to the point himself. And it's in this moment, after Sam wakes Adam back up to himself, Sam, Adam, and Lee are sitting around these two nameless boys. Their personalities are just on the cusp of individuating, that the most important conversation of this whole fat novel takes place. And it's a conversation that manages to span for the rest of the novel. Right away, as these three men are searching out good names for these twin boys, immediately they glom onto the story of Cain and Abel, and for good reason. Already there's a floating theme in the book of what happens when a father chooses an obvious favorite of his son, and how that can drive a rift between the boys, between the brothers. Adam was the favorite of his father, and this created a huge point of contention between himself and his brother Charles, and it's kind of this heavy thing throughout the entire book. And now we have these twin boys that have been growing in the wild in this quasi-Edenic paradise that will obviously have to contend with the mess left to them by their parents, likely for the rest of their lives. So there's some really heavy overtones of the Cain and Abel story on these twins as they're just fresh and new in the world. And this is something that these three men, Adam, Lee, and Sam, are wrestling with. As the three men are discussing the story of Cain and Abel, big questions start to arise. Was Cain's punishment a fair one? The three men have a lot of understanding as to why Cain might have been upset about the difference in treatment between himself and Abel, and they suggest that Cain operated from a place of violent passion, that he wasn't in full control of himself. And there's this big question around the punishment that is laid on him. Looking at the text of this story, which they pull up during the naming of these boys, it seems to them that God has punished Cain to live under the hand of his sinful nature for the rest of his life. And if Cain is the only brother to have given birth to children, our three philosophers wonder, is his fate our fate? Are we as humanity fated to constantly make mistakes, to constantly be abiding under our worst nature? So with that under our belts, let's pull up the chart. Whenever I plug in these charts, I always set the location to New York unless the book was published in a different country, just because most of our publishing companies here in the US are based in New York. And then at some point, I kind of arbitrarily decided to set the time for 8 a.m. Now, I was just thinking about when these books might be available to the public, like that first moment when the bookstores are opened and somebody can go in and buy this book. This is the moment that I've just arbitrarily decided is the moment we're looking at for our book's birth chart. Now, usually I don't consider the houses even, so the timing just isn't a huge factor for me. But one thing I would really like to point out with this chart is that using this timing, there are a couple of really significant things that jump out to me. Here we're looking at the chart for a book called East of Eden. And the first thing that caught my eye is that we have this double stellium taking place on either side of the eastern horizon. We've got a stellium here in Virgo and a stellium here in Libra. Here's how the book opens. I remember that the Gabilan Mountains to the east of the valley were light, gay mountains, full of sun and loveliness and a kind of invitation, so that you wanted to climb into their warm foothills, almost as you want to climb into the lap of a beloved mother. They were beckoning mountains with a brown grass love. The Santa Lucias stood up against the sky to the west and kept the valley from the open sea, and they were dark and brooding, unfriendly and dangerous. I always found in myself a dread of west and a love of east. Where I ever got such an idea I cannot say, unless it could be that the morning came over the peaks of the Gobelins, and the night drifted back from the ridges of the Santa Lucias. It may be that the birth and death of the day had some part in my feeling about the two ranges of mountains. I would also like to point out that the title East of Eden refers specifically to that place of exile in which the story of Cain and Abel takes place. So here we find this really significant symbolic focus on the eastern horizon, not only in the book, but also in the chart. So what this tells me is that this chart looks like a radical chart. The term radical is something that we use in certain branches of astrology to say when it looks like a chart is really speaking. The word radical means rooted. It has the same root as the word radish. So here it seems as if the context of the story, the symbols that we're working with in the story, are already rooted in this chart, even down to the house placements. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and use this chart, even down to the houses, as a radical basis for our interpretation of the story. First, I would just like to unpack Virgo and Libra generally. Like I said, it's really significant that we have this stellium in Virgo and Libra, the fact that they straddle either side of that eastern horizon. So I want to start by just getting a really basic understanding of how Virgo and Libra are similar and how they're different. Both Virgo and Libra are signs interested in rightness. In the northern hemisphere, they take place in the fall, and there's this really symbolic, resonant theme of preparing for leaner times that permeates both Virgo and Libra as signs. Now, the way in which they approach this preparedness, the way in which they approach this sense of rightness differs. Virgo is interested with rightness on an earthy level. Virgo is interested in very practical and physical expressions of rightness. It aims to organize everything, seeing that every piece gets in its right place, and it's focused in things like purity and self-sovereignty. You know, we can think of that image of the Virgin and the different meanings of that symbol. On the other hand, Libra as an air sign is interested in these themes more in terms of ideals. It looks to justice rather than purity. And it's interested in rightness in a social sense, especially as it pertains to one's fellow man. Seeing that Virgo is in the place of the 12th house of this chart, the 12th house is said to be the place of bad spirit, the bad diamond, as well as the place of self-undoing. We may begin to think about some of the extremes of this sense of purity, this sense of self-sovereignty. I'm going to pull a couple of examples from the book to illustrate this. On page 485, we have Aaron confessing something about himself. He says, "I wish we had in our church, well, I might as well say it. I wish we had something like the Augustines or the Franciscans, somewhere to withdraw. Sometimes I feel dirty. I want to get away from the dirt and be clean." Aaron is one of the twin boys, and he has this preponderance with purity, and he's so extreme in his sense of purity that even his mentor, the Episcopalian priest at the church that he attends, is like, "Dude, you're pushing things a little bit too far." And here on page 509, we have an image of Kathy, the psychopath that I mentioned. She's not called a psychopath directly in the book, but she is called a monster, so take that for what it's worth. Here, Kathy is reflecting on Aaron. She says, "There is something frigidly beautiful about him, something untouched and untouchable." Well, had anything or anybody ever really touched Kate? Kate, by the way, is Kathy's alias, so she's talking about herself. Had anything or anybody ever really touched Kate? Really got through and soiled her? Certainly not. Only the hard outside had been brushed by contacts. Inside she was intact, as clean and bright as this boy Alec. Was that his name? No, his name was Aaron, but she's more interested in herself than anybody else. And here is this image of self-sovereignty pushed to the extreme. This is self-sovereignty where it becomes pathological. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and look to Libra specifically. Libra, being in the first house, is less obviously afflicted. We also have the sign ruler, Venus, sitting right next to the exaltation lord, Saturn, working together to seek out what is true and right and beautiful. This is our three philosophers sitting together and trying to unpack what is true, what is right, what is fair, and dare I say it, what is beautiful about this story of Cain and Abel. Seeing Saturn and Venus sitting here side by side in excellent dignity, we might begin to wonder if perhaps they're even suggesting that what is right, what is fair is beautiful. Here's another selection from the book. On page 356, Lee is telling the tragic story about his life origins, and he's speaking about his father. He says his father said, "There's more beauty in the truth, even if it is dreadful beauty. The storytellers at the city gate twist life so that it looks sweet to the lazy and the stupid and the weak, and this only strengthens their infirmities and teaches nothing, cures nothing, nor does it let the heart soar." But one might pose the question, if what is true is beautiful, can you flip it? Is what is beautiful true? And this, I think, is where we get the shadow, the extreme side of this Libra archetype here in the story. If you notice, Venus is beginning to approach Neptune. I mean, she's very closely aligned to Neptune. They're just a degree off. Here we have this image of beauty beset by enchantment, and enchantment sometimes can lead to foggy thinking. Here we might have an over-idealization of beautiful things. We might think of the way that people fall head over heels over Kathy, her beauty, her charm. This ultimately puts them in a vulnerable position to be fed off of by her. People can't seem to see Kathy clearly at all, and so they make up this image of her internal beauty that lives only in themselves, as a way of trying to match their sense of her with her external beauty. We might also think of Sam Hamilton, who reveres the beauty of thought so much that he fails to model basic living to his children. And honestly, I don't have any real complaints with Sam Hamilton. Like, he's one of my favorite characters. He's a really beautiful person. But there's a lot of fraught struggles in his story and in his family, and I can't help but wonder if it's got something to do with the fact that he was so caught up in the beauty of his own thoughts that he didn't manage to bring things down to earth always. His son Tom, for example, spends much of the novel wrestling with greatness, as Sam puts it, rather than simply seeking out a good life. And this pressure of seeking out greatness is so strong, it's so profound, that it ultimately ends up breaking him. Where do we put Tom in this chart? Is he like that Venus clouded by Neptune, obsessive with what is beautiful and true, and unable to see it in the manifested world? Or is he more like this Virgo archetype, trying to strong-arm himself into being something that is better, more pure, more good? Throughout the novel, characters seem to slip across this divide. Aaron's easy likability, his natural goodness as a boy, becomes puritanical as a young adult. Cal's meanness and his vaguely psychopathic tendencies becomes conscience. Let's look back to this Virgo for a moment though, because we unpacked the planets in Libra. Now it's time to look at the planets that are sitting here in Virgo. They're really significant. As in Libra, we have both the ruler and the exaltation lord sitting in Virgo. Mercury is both the ruler and the exaltation in the sign of Virgo. So we have both again here. Mercury is our god of communication. He's analytical, calculating, systematic. He's an excellent craftsman, and he's also a psychopomp. One of Mercury's major roles as messenger is to carry souls across thresholds. Mercury is under the beams of the sun here, but because Mercury is both in domicile and exalted, Mercury is said to be in chariot, so there's a form of protection for Mercury against the bad things that may happen to him as a result of being under the beams of the sun. And here, Mercury is playing psychopomp to a new moon. This new moon is taking place just over the eastern horizon, and this feels incredibly significant when we reconsider that mixed legacy of the East as the place of exile from Eden, but also as that place full of sun and loveliness and a kind of invitation. There's something fresh and new being born here in the sign of Virgo, in this place of wrestling for goodness and purity and bad spirits and self-undoing. With this highly dignified Mercury taken in conjunction with this new moon, I think it points to the sense of choice that is born throughout the novel and throughout the story of Cain and Abel. And this sense of choice rests upon the differing translations of a single Hebrew word, timshol. At the end of the Cain and Abel story, God tells Cain something about the nature of his relationship in regards to sin. But what this relationship really isn't quite clear because of these differing translations of the Bible. Listen to this. Here, Lee is coming back to this conversation years later, building on something that was left hanging in that first naming ceremony for the twins. Lee's hand shook as he filled the delicate cups. He drank his down in one gulp. "Don't you see?" he cried. "The American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin, and you can call sin ignorance. The King James translation makes a promise in 'thou shalt,' meaning that men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the word timshol, 'thou mayest,' that gives a choice. It might be the most important word in the world. That says the way is open. That throws it right back on a man. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not. Don't you see?" So with this choice, there's also a sense of responsibility. The story has not yet over. And this is the crux of the whole novel, because this choice doesn't exist in the easy goodness that is evoked by the Libra archetype in this novel. There's no choice that needs to be made in easy goodness at all. This choice, this new beginning, takes place in the wrestling with purity, with goodness, with a desire to control, in the place of bad spirit, in the darkness of the 12th house. Now, I promised to take a look at the significance of the novel in relation to our times, so let me show you something really quick. We have some significant synastry taking place between this chart and the sky as it exists right now. Check out this Pluto. Here we have Pluto in Leo, and currently Pluto is hanging out in Aquarius, so this Pluto is significant on a generational level, especially when we consider that this novel is a book of Americana. It attempts to wrestle with the story of Cain and Abel not only on a personal level, but on the national level as well, attempting to unpack what it means for us as Americans to be almost always at war. Almost accidentally. Another point of significance here is that Pluto is conjoined the south node of the moon across the Leo-Aquarius axis. And what's interesting is that this year, the nodes of the moon are beginning to shift into that Leo-Aquarius axis. We've already had one eclipse take place in Aquarius. By the end of the year, those nodes will have totally shifted. But for now, we're having a few solar eclipses that are taking place out of sign in that Leo-Aquarius axis, sort of revving up this place as the nodes move into that position. So there's a lot to consider across this Leo-Aquarius axis, and this only becomes more interesting when we consider that the Sibley chart, which is the birth chart of America, we also have the nodes of the moon in this Leo and Aquarius axis. What's interesting is that in that Sibley chart, in the birth chart of America, the nodes are flipped. In that version of the chart, we have the north node in Leo and the south node in Aquarius. The nodes are said to be like the head and tail of the dragon. The head is the direction in which we are moving. The tail is like that thing that we're leaving behind, for better or worse. Both can express in positive and negative ways. But in the Sibley chart, the north node sits in the place of Leo, which speaks to this fabled American quest towards personal freedom. With the south node in Aquarius, this suggests that this quest towards personal freedom is upheld by the anonymizing power of war, the machine of war. But in our current chart, and in the East of Eden chart, The nodal orientation is such that it's the south node in Leo. There's a flip. The north node is in Aquarius, the south node is in Leo. What could this mean? One possible interpretation is that unless we claim the mantle of personal responsibility, that dark twin to freedom, unless we embody that timshel, that choice to overcome that which is dark and sinful in our nature, we risk becoming a machine ourselves, anonymizing and cold. Here's one last passage to leave you with. I don't know how it will be in the years to come. There are monstrous changes taking place in the world, forces shaping a future whose face we do not know. Some of these forces seem evil to us, perhaps not in themselves, but because their tendency is to eliminate other things we hold good. It is true that 2 men can lift a bigger stone than 1 man. That's the Aquarian collective. A group can build automobiles quicker and better than 1 man, and bread from a huge factory is cheaper and more uniform. When our food and clothing and housing are all born in the complication of mass production, mass method is bound to get into our thinking and to eliminate all other thinking. Our species is the only creative species, and it has only one creative instrument, the individual mind and spirit of a man. Once the miracle of creation has taken place, the group can build and extend it, but the group never invents anything. The preciousness lies in the lonely mind of a man. And now the forces marshaled around the concept of the group have declared a war of extermination on that preciousness, the mind of man. By disparagement, by starvation, by repressions, forced direction, and the stunning hammer blows of conditioning, the free roving mind is being pursued, roped, blunted, drugged. It is a sad suicidal course our species seems to have taken. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing this video. If you've read East of Eden, I would love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What did you think of this chart reading? Did it resonate with your experience of the book? And if you haven't read it, I hope this video inspires you to at least check it out. It's definitely one of the best books that I've read all year. If there's a book that you would like me to break down like this, please let me know. Just drop your suggestions in the comments and I'll check it out. Until next time.